Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro, who was captured by U.S. forces in Caracas, arrived at a military base in the U.S. on Saturday evening. The left-wing leader was captured after months of threats and pressure tactics by President Donald Trump in a swift but audacious military operation. Well, Maduro was seen surrounded by FBI agents as he descended the boarding stairs of a U.S. government plane at a New York State National Guard facility and was slowly escorted along the tarmac. Vehicles which were possibly transporting Maduro were filmed leaving the heliport. A helicopter that may have been carrying Venezuelan president was later seen over Manhattan. Now, according to reports, Maduro will be transferred to the Metropolitan Detention Center in the Sunset Park neighborhood of Brooklyn. Maduro and his wife, seized overnight from their homes on a military base, were first taken aboard a U.S. warship on their way to face prosecution for a Justice Department indictment, accusing them of participating in a narco-terrorism conspiracy. And following the military action, Trump said that the United States will run Venezuela with A Group and will tap into its huge oil reserves. Trump said he was designated people from his cabinet to be in charge of Venezuela, but gave no details of how this would work.
We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. So we don't want to be involved with having somebody else get in, and we have the same situation that we had for the last long period of years. So we are going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. And it has to be judicious, because that's what we're all about. We're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, the oil infrastructure, and start making money for the country.
Trump also indicated that U.S. troops could be deployed in Venezuela in the near future and said that Washington is not afraid of boots on the ground.
Well, you know, they always say boots on the ground. Oh, so we're not afraid of boots on the ground if we have to have. We had boots on the ground last night at a very high level, actually. We're not afraid of it. We don't mind saying it. But we're going to make sure that that country is run properly. We're not doing this in vain. This is a very dangerous attack. This is an attack that could have gone very, very badly.
The U.S. president also described the current state of the Latin American country and said that U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio had been in touch with Venezuelan Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, who had been sworn in as Maduro's successor. Trump touted that Rodriguez was essentially willing to work with Washington.
You have a vice president who's been appointed by Maduro, and right now she's the vice president, and she's, I guess, the president. She was sworn in as president just a little while ago. She had a long conversation with Marco, and she said, we'll do whatever you need. I think she was quite gracious, but she really doesn't have a choice.
Well, contrary to Trump's statement, Venezuelan Vice President Delcy Rodriguez demanded the immediate release of President Nicolás Maduro and First Lady Celia Flores. Rodriguez came live on state television alongside senior government and military officials. She said that the country's political and military leadership was unified and fully mobilized.
We demand the immediate release of President Nicolás Maduro and his wife Celia Flores, the only president of Venezuela, President Nicolás Maduro. Here is the most important high command of the Venezuelan state, the military high command, the high command of the state, the high command of the Council of the Vice President. All factors are combined. Political factors of national power in Venezuela.
And for more on this, we're now being joined by Dr. Charles Kupchan. He's a senior fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations. Thank you so much for joining us in the broadcast. Dr. Kupchan, let's start with your assessment of everything that's transpired in the last 24 hours in Venezuela.
Well, I'm not surprised that this has happened. We've seen a huge buildup of American military forces, strikes against boats that have been allegedly running drugs. So I think many of us here in Washington expected some kind of military operation of this sort. But I have to say that Trump is really running some very high risks here on three fronts. One, the legal front. What's the justification for this? There was no UN Security Council resolution. Venezuela did not commit an act of aggression, territorial aggression against the the United States? What message does this send to the Chinese, to the Russians, to the others? Number two, where does this go? You know, the United States does not have a good track record of forced regime change leading to good outcomes. We don't know what comes tomorrow or the day after. We have no idea whether the government that's left in Venezuela is going to work with the United States. And then finally, there's a political risk because Trump ran for office basically arguing against nation building, against the United States doing exactly the kind of military operation that it has undertaken in the last 24 hours. So we could see a revolt of sorts in his own political base here in the United States.
Of course, Dr. Kapchan, let's start with the first challenge that you mentioned, which was the legality of the strikes. We know that there have been pointed questions about the legality and any legal justification which could be there for the strike and the subsequent arrest. How is Washington reacting to this?
Well, I think that as it has done since taking office almost a year ago now, the Trump administration will try some fancy footwork to justify this legally. My guess is they may say that, listen, we know that Maduro was a drug runner and this is a law enforcement mission, and we have backed up the law enforcement mission with military force, somewhat similar to the case that was made for Noriega back in the George W. Bush days. But I do think that the idea of aircraft, of bombs, of troops intervening in Venezuela is going to make this a very hard case. And as I said before, I do think it sets a very bad precedent about major powers intervening in their neighbors when they feel like it. So these kinds of legal issues have not stopped the Trump administration before. They didn't stop them when it came to intervening in Venezuela. So I think you'll just live with legal ambiguity over this operation for the foreseeable future.
Right, and we understand there is a vacuum of power in Venezuela at the moment, and Trump has said that US will run Venezuela until a safe, proper and judicial transition can take place. Now, Dr. Kapchan, how do you think that will play out given Trump's America First agenda and whatever has happened being antithetical to exactly that?
Well, you know, I think your report really put its finger on the issue here. Mr. Trump said that, well, you know, Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president, she's going to work with us. And then not long after he says that, she gets on television and basically says Maduro's the president. We're going to stand up to the United States. And there is a long history in Latin America of anti-imperial, anti-colonial sentiment. So I think it's just way too soon to predict where this goes. Under the best of circumstances, we get some kind of peaceful change, a government in Venezuela that works with the United States. But we could see just the opposite. We could see a government that says we need to stand up to Donald Trump, we need to resist American pressure. And then I think Trump's in trouble because he may then face the prospect of having to get much more deeply involved, including boots on the ground. What does he mean when he says we're going to run Venezuela? At this point, we don't know, but that's a very tall order.
Absolutely, and while that is a tall order and the vagueness around the details of it is just heightening the tension around it, the Venezuelan oil reserves have remained one of the major focus during the turmoil, and Trump said that it was during the press conference that the US oil companies will rebuild the Venezuelan oil industry. Now, what kind of an impact will that have on oil and trade?
Well, we know that Donald Trump is very much focused on oil, on minerals, on this whole question of getting away from wind and solar power and relying more on fossil fuels. And we also know that the Trump administration believes, not without justification, that American assets, big oil companies, had huge investments in Venezuela. And going back to the 1970s, those assets were nationalized by Venezuela and the companies were not given sufficient compensation. And so there's this sense that in some ways these are companies that are due more access to Venezuelan oil. Again, I think the key question here is what kind of next government do you get in Venezuela? Are they going to be willing to work with U.S. oil companies? There's no question that the country has let its oil infrastructure atrophy and it needs help. Whether it's prepared to work with American companies after this kind of military intervention, let's wait and see.
Absolutely. So, and while we know that a lot of questions are arising about what will happen in Venezuela post Maduro, and we know that Trump has dismissed Maria Corina Machado by saying that she does not have either the support or the respect in the country. Now, by doing all of this and everything that has transpired in the last 24 hours, what message do you think US is sending to its adversaries? And you mentioned China and Iran. China and Russia. But now we also look at Iran, which has been on the receiving end of a lot of threats from US, much like Venezuela. Could Iran be next, perhaps, to face the ire of United States?
I do think that it's positive that the Trump administration didn't destroy the regime and go after military targets and go after political targets, because I think we learned the hard way in countries like Libya and Iraq and Afghanistan that if you take down the regime and destroy the infrastructure, you get chaos. And as a consequence, it was probably the right thing to leave in place the Maduro government, even without Maduro. But it does raise questions about that patronage system, who they're going to work with. I found it surprising that he so readily, Mr. Trump, dismissed Ms. Machado, who many people see as the legitimate ruler or the legitimate inheritor of the political situation in Venezuela. Where does this go next? Who knows? I guess if there's a country that probably ought to be on guard right now, it's Cuba. But you are right to mention Iran, because just in the last couple of days, Mr. Trump did warn the Iranians that if they go after the protesters, then they kill a lot of people, the United States is going to step in. What does step in mean? Again, we don't know.
Right, sir. And having said that, how will this military operation impact US's reputation across South America? I'm curious to know your thoughts on that.
I think that countries are being cautious, particularly European countries that are afraid of getting on the wrong side of Trump. But given the long history of American intervention in Latin America, really going back to the 19th century, beginning in 1898, the Spanish-American War, repeated military interventions of the United States, I don't think this is going to go over well. Mr. Maduro did not have a lot of friends in the region. That having been said, I think this kind of bold use of force by the United States in many respects just reanimates concern about American overreach and American imperialism. And I think you're going to see a lot of pushback against the United States as a result of this. And that has already started, because as we all know, the tariffs, the unilateralism, the strikes on drug boats, this has all led to a lot of disconsternation and disorientation in the international system about where Donald Trump and America first are headed.
Absolutely, Dr. Kapshan. Now, what can we expect in the hours to come? We seem to be having some problem connecting with Dr. Kapshan, but those were some very valid points, and of course we'll have to wait and see how the situation develops from here.